Okay, this video is about the glymphatic system. Glymphatic stands for glial, like astrocytes. Those are supporting cells in the brain, kind of like the mama cells to the neurons that help the neurons to do their job. Lymphatic means that they have now discovered lymphatic tissue, not in the brain parenchyma itself. So here's the brain parenchyma itself, but up here in the dura mater adjacent to the sagittal sinus. And this has now been shown as a way that the brain cleans itself. It's one of the mechanisms by which the brain cleans itself at night while we're asleep. The brain can't clean itself in the daytime because the neurons are online, they're functioning, and they have to maintain a precise neuronal milieu in the extracellular matrix. So the fluid around the neuron has to stay exactly the same in terms of the ion gradients in there, the sodium and the potassium and the calcium, for example. And so only at night while the person's asleep can the brain parenchyma change its composition such that the cerebrospinal fluid can flow around it. We'll show pictures of all this in just a moment, but that's the reason why it only happens at night, and that's why you have to sleep, so you can run the glymphatic system. Okay, here is a picture from, so Maiken Nedergaard, PhD, was, along with Jeffery LLif, were two of the pioneer investigators that figured out the glymphatic system. They first figured it out in mice and rats, and then it's been shown the supportive data with MRI studies, with MRI contrast cystogram studies, also with cerebral neck lymph node studies to indicate that humans have it as well. So this is the skull, okay, around our brains. And then this right here is a subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space contains cerebrospinal fluid. I'll go into more detail to explain this in a moment, but I'm just letting you see a picture of it so you can get a sense of it when I start talking about the terminology more. So these arteries enter the brain. So these are called the penetrating arteries that enter the brain parenchyma. The outer surface of the brain is called the pia. So these are called a pial artery. And then the penetrating component enters the brain parenchyma. Circumferentially, well, some people say it's not completely circumferential, but for the purpose of this diagram, circumferential surrounding of the penetrating artery is cerebrospinal fluid. It'll be this yellow stuff right here, and it is going to escape from this para-arterial space and then pass into the brain parenchyma at night while we're sleeping. The neurons right here, they're drawn in purple on this diagram. They're pushing out this material here, these black spots in this picture here, and those represent the waste products from the neuron. And then the cerebrospinal fluid is flowing along the neurons, and it's rinsing these waste products into the paravertebral space that surrounds the vein. So what propels the whole thing? The pumping pressure of the arteries pressurizes the cerebrospinal fluid to push it along the brain parenchymal tissue. Parenchyma just means where the actual functioning cells are. And that then rinses it into the paravertebral space around the vein, and then it'll exit back out into the greater CSF space, and it's later going to be cleared in through something called arachnoid granulations, these little yellow spots going into the venous sinuses. Okay, these little sort of purplish red channels right here are called aquaporin channels. They got it abbreviated AQP4. So aquaporin, sort of water or cerebrospinal fluid channels. The green little foot-like processes around the paravascular space are from the astrocytes, and that means the supporting cells. Here's an example of a supporting cell for neurons, an astrocyte. They're shaped like a star. That's why they're called astro, meaning star, cyte, meaning cell. So this is how we'll see another picture of it after we've gone through the details and come back to this, but this is how the glymphatic system works. At night, basically the neurons clean themselves. It's like Victorian England where they'll pour out their chamber pots into the street, let's say at night, and then fluid rinses the waste products away. Okay, and the reason it matters is the brain needs to clean itself in order for the brain to function effectively. And the worse the brain cleaning system becomes, if it's damaged, the higher the risk of the person becoming demented. Okay, so for neurons to function well, we need to sleep. They need to have a precise ionic milieu in the daytime, and the brain's online, so this cannot happen in the daytime. The brain has a blood-brain barrier to protect and maintain neuronal milieu It's not like the blood vessels, the artery. After you eat a meal, all kinds of chemicals rush into the blood vessels, but you can't have that happening around a neuron. That's why you have a blood-brain barrier. This is also one of the problems with fat, especially saturated fat is well known to damage the blood-brain barrier, make it more permeable, and that lets some chemicals get contact with the brain parenchyma, which can be detrimental to brain function. Okay, the brain is surrounded by cerebrospinal fluid, and the cerebrospinal fluid, everybody learns it initially as being like a water helmet for football, and it does other things besides that. So that protects the brain from trauma to some extent. It also keeps the brain floating up so it doesn't sink down into the skull base. So that's two things that the cerebrospinal fluid does. The third thing is it helps to cool the brain. We'll see a picture of that. You got air-filled sinuses in your forehead and behind your nose and in your cheeks, and where those parts are adjacent to the brain, they cool the fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid running next to them, and that runs along the brain to cool it off a little bit. We'll see. I'll explain that more when we get to the picture. They then help to remove neuronal waste products through the glymphatic system. We talked about Victorian England dumping out their chamber pods is what the neurons do, and then the CSF rinses it away. There's good videos online if you want to see more about this. Maiken Nedergaard, she's the lady, she'll probably get a Nobel Prize for her discovery, along with Jeffery LLif of how the glymphatic system works. And she's got a lot of lectures, as does Jeffery LLif, about the glymphatic system. They're quite good. So once it was discovered, now the big step is how much does it contribute to neurodegeneration, and can anything be done from it to make it work better, or that sort of thing. Okay, glymphatic, again, the GL is for glial, for the glial cells like astrocytes, and then the L, lymphatic, is the lymphatic system. The fact that this was a big discovery not that long ago, only a couple years ago, was the lymphatics discovered around the brain, and then soon after all the glymphatic component. It only runs at night. That's a big deal. You got to get your sleep if you want your brain to be function optimally the next day. What happens at night is the neurons shrink while they're asleep, and then the extracellular matrix, meaning the space around the neuron, that opens up about 24%, and then the CSF flows like a river, rinsing away all the waste products from the neurons. Every cell in the body has to clean itself. Every cells in the body outside of the brain have lymphatics running right next to them. The brain is unique in that there's no lymphatics in the parenchyma itself. So MRI cisternogram helps show it in humans. The brain metabolic rate only decreases about 15% at night. So what's happening is the neuron metabolic rate is decreasing quite a bit, but the supporting cells of the neuron have to work a lot to, clean everything up at night. It's like the janitor crew coming in at night to clean everything. The paravascular space that runs around the penetrating arteries and the exiting veins is also called PVS of VR. What that means is perivascular space of Virchow-Robin. So Virchow and Robin were pathologists that helped discover the anatomy of these spaces originally. Sleep deprivation causes increased cortisol, leads to decreased neurogenesis, meaning decreased formation of new neurons in the brain. In mice, they've shown that this means decreased dendrite complexity. The animal becomes stupider. And if the animal doesn't get enough sleep, prolonged sleep deprivation leads to death of the animal. Okay. CSF, perivascular space. The fluid exits the perivascular space and gets into the brain parenchyma by going through the aquaporin 4 water channels in the astrocyte feet, and the foot processes of the astrocytes, the star-shaped supporting cells. It's the arterial pulsations of the penetrating arteries, and they're all tortuous, and that has a mechanism that's called an Archimedes pump. So it's an Archimedes pump-like mechanism that propels the CSF into the brain. I wonder if neck lymph nodes are bigger in the morning. I got to figure that out. I'm not sure yet, but you would expect they would be based on this. Also, this is why you're smartest in the morning when you first wake up, because your glymphatic system's cleaned your brain at night. So your brain's all clean and ready to go. Your neurons have expelled their waste products. They're all fresh and ready. It's like your battery is recharged. There's other reasons why we're smartest in the morning, too. We got ghrelin going to increase alertness. We got good blood sugar, etc. Okay, they do contain the neck lymph nodes. They've taken the neck lymph nodes out on people, and they'll contain 40 times more beta amyloid protein than they get in the inguinal nodes. And that's consistent with the idea that it appears the glymphatic system is helping to clear beta amyloid protein from the brain, and that's thought to help reduce the risk of Alzheimer's. Now, that's a whole big subject going into beta amyloid clearance and Alzheimer's. We'll talk about that in a different lecture, but the point I'm making is it was useful supportive data to suggest that the glymphatic system in humans is relevant and might be related to dementia risk. Okay, it was also shown from their research that when the animals slept with the right side down, they had optimal CSF clearance, so the best possible rates of CSF clearance. And Maiken Nedergaard believes that's because the heart is higher when your right side's down, because the heart is more of a left-sided chest structure, and she believes that makes it easier for the heart to pump, so you don't need as much sympathetic tone, norepinephrine hormone on it. I don't know. I've looked at the brains, and to me, the transverse sinuses are typically bigger on the right. Maybe that's why people tend to prefer sleeping with their right side down. Also, when your right side's down, your heart's more of a left-sided structure. That way you don't feel it beating against your chest. But anyways. So here's a coronal image of the brain. That means looking from front to back. So this would be the right side of the brain, left side of the brain. It's always as if the patient's feet were towards you. So their right foot would be towards you here, left foot. So this is right brain, left brain. Frontal lobes up on top, temporal lobes down here. We talked about the hippocampus before, the memory center. The gray matter ribbon tracks along the outer surface of the brain. It's gray matter because that's what it looks at gross anatomy when you look at an autopsy of a brain. And that's where you got most of your metabolic activity in the cell bodies along the periphery. Cortex is a Latin word. It means like bark, like the bark of a tree. Okay, so we're in a moment, we're going to start showing the structures around the outer surface of the brain. This was just to orientate you. Oh, one more picture here. Here's a sagittal brain. So this would be split down the middle, a sagittal split. So this is the cerebral cortex, the so-called primate human brain. Down here is I painted it yellow. Yellow is... that color doesn't mean anything on this particular drawing. It was just to show, here's the brain stem. That's called the reptile brain. And then above it's shaped like a C. This right here is the mammal brain. It's going to curve around down below as well from the cingulate gyrus down into the medial temporal lobe, parahippocampal gyrus. And that is your mammal brain or limbic system brain. And then the third brain of this is MacLean's triple brain or triune brain, is the cerebral cortex, the primate brain, the higher brain. So this is based on the idea that brainstem, here's your brainstem, limbic system on top of it like a C, and then cerebral cortex above the whole thing. That's a three-part brain of MacLean. That ends up being a useful concept. And what we're going to see is that there's cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, overlapping these structures. It's going to be right in here is where the lateral ventricles are going to be. Okay, so here is a drawing of the ventricular system of the brain, the fluid around the brain. So these are called the lateral ventricles, this part up in here. This part projecting in towards the frontal lobes is going to be the frontal horn. This part projecting into the occipital lobes is the occipital horn. This part which projects into the temporal lobe is the temporal horn. This little bit of red stuff in the lateral ventricle up here is called the choroid plexus, and that makes cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid exits the choroid plexus, passes down through the foramen of Monroe, goes into the third ventricle, through the aqueduct of Sylvius, goes into the fourth ventricle, exits the foramen of Magendie, as well as what's called the foramen of Luschka, and then enters the general CSF space around the outer surface of the brain, the convexity surface of the brain, because it's convex outwardly. And then this cerebrospinal fluid is then partially absorbed into what are called arachnoid villi, or granulations, which project into the venous sinuses. Venous sinuses are just the big veins that are inside the dura that project all along the outer surface of the brain. Okay, so this is the general CSF flow pattern, and only at night does the CSF enter the brain parenchyma itself in any significant way. Okay, so this is sort of the baseline to help us understand what's happening on the big picture outside of the glymphatic system, which is going to be a more detailed picture inside the brain parenchyma itself. Okay, here is the skull. The purple stands for skull, the bone of the skull. And these air-filled spaces are your paranasal sinuses. That's where people get sinusitis. These are around your nose, so they're called paranasal sinuses. Here's the frontal sinus, and it's cool. So when cerebrospinal fluid passes next to it, it gets cooled a little bit. Here's the sphenoid sinus, and again, cerebrospinal fluid passes right next to it, only the bone being separating the two, and that gets cooled, and that then brings coolness around the brain. The brain is very metabolically active, so it's helpful to cool it. That's also why I think the gray matter is around the periphery to help cool it off. And the hippocampus, the memory center, super active, is actually sitting inside of the temporal horn to help cool that off especially even more. Okay, this picture helps us. So here's the hippocampus, and it actually sits in the temporal horn will be right next to it. I don't, this drawing is just a rough sketch by me, but this really cools that part of the brain off. And here's a gray matter ribbon tracking around the outer surface of the brain. There'll be cerebrospinal fluid all in here that helps keep that gray matter ribbon cooled off. And then here's the superior sagittal sinus, the big vein. Here's the arachnoid granulations interdigitating with the superior sinus vein to facilitate absorption of waste products from CSF. And then here's also the lymphatics, which also take some of these waste products away from the brain. And they run in the dura. This thick layer here is called dura mater. That means sort of tough mother or thick mother. And that's the outer layer of what is called the meninges, the layers around the brain of support. Okay, now here's a little more detailed picture of what's happening. So this will be an artery running on the outer surface of the brain, the peel surface of the brain. So this is a peel artery that then enters the brain parenchyma. So it's called a penetrating artery. It penetrates the brain parenchyma. And on its outer surface is cerebrospinal fluid, the yellow stuff. And at nighttime, the astrocyte foot processes with their aquaporin 4 water channels will open up, and they'll let the cerebrospinal fluid flow across the brain parenchymal space where the neurons are. The neurons pop out their waste products, and this cerebrospinal fluid rinses them like a river, rinses the waste products over to the vascular space around the veins of the brain, and then they get rinsed in the cerebrospinal fluid. Then later on, they're going to get absorbed through those arachnoid granulations and through a couple other locations. But that's the key point. Cerebrospinal fluid is rinsing off the brain neurons at night so they can get rid of their waste products. Here's a typical appearance of a neuron. There's a cell body where its nucleus is with the DNA. There's a long axon that then travels to a synapse where it interacts with another neuron. So this is the presynaptic neuron, postsynaptic neuron. A neurotransmitter will be released across this distance from presynaptic to postsynaptic neuron. The space in between is going to be called the synaptic cleft. An astrocyte will wrap around this to help with making that synapse run effectively. Glial cells are our astrocytes. Astro shaped like a star, cyte meaning cell. Okay, so this is just a simplified diagram to give you an idea of how the glymphatic system works. And then I'll show you another picture, again, the picture of Nedergaard. Maiken Nedergaard is her name, PhD, who was the pioneering discoverer of this. She'll probably win a Nobel Prize, her and Jeffery LLif, and maybe some other investigators. Okay, so anyways, the artery comes in, penetrates the brain parenchyma. It has circumferential cerebrospinal fluid, which then at night, these aquaporin 4 channels of the astrocyte feed open up, so the cerebrospinal fluid can flow over these neurons and rinse these waste products towards the venous side, which then is directed towards expelling these waste products through the arachnoid granulations and into the lymphatics as well. And that's how the glymphatic system of the brain works. That's why you gotta sleep. It's really important. So you get those neurons cleaned, and then you feel your usual bright, energetic, and smart self in the morning. So hope that's helpful.